Justice Initiative, Bryan Stevenson.
Thank you. In 1972, there were 300,000 people in jails and prisons in the United States. Today, there are 2.3 million. We have 8 million people under the control of the criminal justice system. The United States now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's imprisoned. There are 3,000 people awaiting execution. There are tens of thousands of people who've been sentenced to die in prison, some as young as 13 years of age. We have a criminal justice system in America, like too many systems across the world, that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. Wealth, not culpability, shapes outcomes. So I am enormously honored that you would invite someone like me, who does the work that I do, into this community. Because inviting me and welcoming me, you are welcoming a community of people who believe really simple things. We believe that each person is more than the worst thing that they've ever done. I believe when someone tells a lie, they're not just a liar. I believe when someone takes something, they're not just a thief. I think even if you kill someone, you are not just a killer, and justice requires that we understand the other things that people are. And welcoming me, you're welcoming people who believe that the opposite of poverty is not wealth. I think in America and too many places across the world, I don't believe the opposite of poverty is wealth. I believe the opposite of poverty is justice. And if we want to deconstruct poverty, we've got to do justice. And finally, in welcoming me, you welcome a community of people who believe that we have to judge our commitment to social change and progress. We have to judge how we're doing on this planet, not by looking at how we treat the rich and the powerful and the privileged. We have to judge how we're doing by looking at the poor, the incarcerated, and the marginalized. It's in that metric that we see where we're doing. And I wanted to say, to students who are watching, I want you to do well in school, but I want you to understand that your grades do not measure your capacity to change the world. To people who are watching out there, I want you to do well. I want you to have good incomes, but don't ever think your income is going to limit your capacity to change the world. There is a different metric system for those of us who are trying to do justice. It was taught to me by an older man. I was giving a talk in a church one day, and this older man came into the church. He was in a wheelchair, older black man. And the whole time I was talking, he was looking at me with this very stern, almost angry look on his face. And I couldn't figure out why was he looking at me so angrily. And I kept looking at him. He was sort of distracting me. And I got through the talk, and people came up. They were very nice and appropriate. But that man kept sitting in the back staring at me. And he got a young kid to wheel him up to the front of the church. And when he got in front of me, he put his hand up and he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I stood there and I just stared at him. And then this older man looked at me again and he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I stepped back and I mumbled something. I don't even remember what I said. And then he asked me one last time. He said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And then he looked at me and he said, "I'm going to tell you what you're doing." And then this older man looked at me and he said, "You're beating the drum for justice. You keep beating the drum for justice." And I was so moved. I was also deeply relieved because I just didn't know. And then he grabbed me by my jacket and he pulled me into his wheelchair. He said, "Come here, come here, come here, I'm going to show you something." And this older man turned his head and he showed me a scar. He said, "You see this scar I have behind my right ear?" He says, "I got that scar in Greene County, Alabama in 1963, trying to fight for civil rights and registering people to vote." And then he turned his head, he said, "You see this cut?" He said, "I got that cut in Philadelphia, Mississippi, fighting for civil rights, trying to register people to vote." Then he turned his head, he said, "You see this dark spot?" He said, "That's my bruise. I got my bruise in Birmingham, Alabama, 1965, fighting for civil rights, trying to register people to vote." He said, "I'm going to tell you something, young man." He said, "People look at me and they think I'm some old man sitting in a wheelchair covered with cuts and bruises and scars, but I'm going to tell you something." He said, "These aren't my cuts. These aren't my bruises. These aren't my scars." He said, "These are my medals of honor." And I will tell you, as someone who started his education in the segregated colored school and a segregated colored school in the South. As someone who is the parent, as the child of parents who had to suffer the daily humiliations of Jim Crow and segregation, as someone who is the grandson who had to flee lynching and terrorism in the American South, as the great-grandson of people who were enslaved, I will tell you I sometimes feel scarred by America's history of racial injustice. As someone who goes into jails and prisons, I will tell you I sometimes feel bruised by this knowledge that I have, that we have more innocent people in our jails and prisons today than we've ever had in our history. As someone who has to feel and see the presumption of dangerousness and guilt that follows Black and brown people in America, I will tell you that you have done something extraordinary for me today, because today you have turned my cuts, my scars, my bruises, and all of us who fight for justice across the world into medals of honor. And for that, I am enormously grateful. Thank you so, so much.